of the highlights of this course, building the fund sources and uses table. Ordinarily, they're located at the top. Along with the entry assumptions, they're one of the starting points of the leveraged buyout model. We're going to build fund sources and uses and also calculate financing fees altogether because financing fees are one of the components of the fund uses as well, so we have to calculate those as well, so we're going to do them. Let's copy these across and we're going to write fund sources and fund uses. So remember that fund uses are costs such as costs used to acquire the equity value, costs used to assume existing debt, financing costs, advisory fees, legal, other fees, etc. So there are all of the costs associated with this particular deal upon entry. And the fund sources, obviously, it's how are you going to fund these uses. So fund sources will always equal fund uses, and fund sources would be items like excess cash, private equity, equity contribution, and all of the fund sources that we have learned, such as revolvers, term loans, sub notes, convertible bonds, and etc. So usually it's a better idea to finish fund uses first, because that way you can get an idea of how to organize the fund sources. So we're going to start from fund uses. We're going to have total uses. We're going to indent. The biggest value obviously would be the equity value. So for this deal, purchasing the equity value would be most important. And then the debt value as well. So, but we're going to write existing debt. As I mentioned, financing fees. So this is associated with new debt. We're also going to write advisory fees, separate them with advisory fees, as well as legal and other fees as well upon mergers and acquisitions. And for this side, it's going to be total sources. We're going to build a revolver. Again, we're going to indent. Actually, let's format. Oops. Okay. And then we're also going to have some term loans. So we're going to have two types of term loans, term loan A and term loan B. We're also going to create subordinated notes. As well as convertible bonds. So we're trying to include many different types of sources just for practice purposes. If you actually see the results, we don't really need this much different types of fund sources, but for practice purposes we're going to diversify the fund sources. We also have excess cash. The company has around 75 million excess cash, so we're going to utilize that for this deal as well. And lastly, the equity. The equity contribution that the private equity contributes. And then we're going to copy these across. We're going to leave excess cash and equity out. We're going to paste them. And these would be the financing fees. So, because we don't need financing fees for excess cash or equity contribution. And while we're dealing with fees here, let's also assume the advisory fees and the legal and other fees here as well. And lastly, we need just one more line for other assumptions, which at this point of time we need to assume minimum cash balance. So rather than finishing off these assumptions one by one, I've pretty much laid down all of the components at once, because these assumptions cannot be done one by one. It has to be done simultaneously, because one affects the other and the other affects the other. So we're going to do this all at once. So where to begin? Let's begin with something that's most easy. So let's start from the equity value. So equity value would be obviously the value of equity that they're purchasing. So this would equal the entry equity value. So all of these sources are combined to purchase this equity that we have assumed in our entry assumption. So we need $234 million for this purchase. And the company also has existing debt that we have to deal with. So existing debt, we go down to the balance sheet. Existing debt would be the current portion of old debt plus the old total debt balance that we have. Financing fees, advisory fees, and legal and other fees, we cannot complete them at this moment because we didn't finish the financing fees part. So instead, let's go to the total uses and sum up these rows in advance. And actually, let's add a title. I'm going to use single accounting formats. And this is the total amount at this point. Now we're going to come over to the total sources part. And total sources, the amount, should always equal total uses. And then we're going to assume what kind of financial instruments are used to fund this amount. And usually it's expressed in a way, we don't express it right away. It's expressed in multiples of EBITDA. So we need a column to assume the EBITDA multiples for these 5 debt sources. I'm going to do a little bit of formatting. It has to be expressed in multiples. And usually these multiples combined are, well, it really depends on the industry, the company, and the times as well, but usually 4 times, 5 times, 6 times of EBITDA seems usual. But in our case, since the company doesn't have a lot of existing debt, and it seems that the current value is pretty much very undervalued, we're going to assume very conservative funding for the sources. So 0, 1, 1, 0.5, and 0.5. So around a 3 times EBITDA multiple funding. And the current EBITDA is 34.3, so we're gonna multiply the current EBITDA, we're gonna anchor it, times the EBITDA multiple. And then let's come over to the minimum cash balance and finish this assumption first. Let's copy this format, Alt EST. And we're going to put 10 million as minimum cash balance. And this minimum cash balance is cash always, that the amount of cash that's always has to remain for company's daily operations. So just in case something happens, just in case the company needs cash, they always keep a minimum balance just in case for operating purposes. If you have like investing purposes like capex or something huge like M&A deals, usually there's going to be additional funding, but this minimum cash balance is usually just for operations. So when we're putting in assumptions, if you're wondering how much to put in for this specific cell, there are a lot of methods to make an assumption, but usually it's a percentage of operating expenses or a multiple of operating expenses, or some people analyze working capital and minimum cash balance, make it something associated with increases in working capital, because that's the amount of cash that the company needs for operations. But in this case, we just simply put in 10 million. We're not going to put in that much effort in this model. Maybe in later contents we'll try to make an analysis and put in some realistic numbers. So excess cash that the company can use, we have to leave out the minimum cash balance. We cannot use the 10 million that's untouchable. So currently we have cash and equivalents, we have short-term financial assets, but we cannot utilize minimum cash balance. So it has to be subtracted. And the rest is how much the private equity firm is going to invest. So it's kind of like a plug. So as a percentage, the private equity at this structure is investing responsible for about 40% of the total services. Of course, when we finish the financing fees, it could change. Let's copy these two titles. And financing fees are usually calculated as a percentage of the total fee. So it's a percentage fee and the actual fee. We need a percentage assumption format. for advisory fees as well. And we're going to assume a 1% fee for all of these sources. So it's going to be the amount of debt raised times the fee. We don't have to anchor any of these. We just simply have to copy it down. And the financing fees would be the summation of these fees. So about a $1 million financing fee. We're going to link it to the fund uses, which is quite minor in this case, but yeah, in actual practice or when you're doing some kind of modeling test or something, they could require you to calculate financing fees. So we have to know how it's done. Advisory fees are usually as percentage of enterprise value or equity value, but we're going to do equity value instead. So 1% of the equity value is the advisory fee. If the deal becomes bigger and bigger, advisory fees, the percentage rate can decline. If the deal's small, the percentage fees could be larger. So we have a $2.3 million advisory fee. And legal and other fees, let's just assume 1 million. I'm just gonna going to copy this format. So 1 million legal and other fees, similar to the financing fees. And there we have it. We finished the fund uses. We've also finished the fund sources, the financing fees, and the minimum cash balance assumptions as well. Remember that we started from fund uses. Maybe it was a better idea to finish off the minimum cash balance first. We've left out financing fees, the fees part, blank. We had to move over to sources and assume how much debt is going to be raised, and then we came down to financing fees. We've calculated the fees, and it's kind of like a circular reference, but it's not a circular reference, but the one refers to the other, and we have to do this job simultaneously. So this is it for fund sources and uses. It won't get much more complicated than this in most modeling tests. Most modeling tests. The next part is the trickiest part. I personally, in this building this leveraged buyout model, is to make balance sheet adjustments. Now that we have decided on how much to raise as fund sources, we have to make adjustments and make a pro forma balance sheet based on the assumptions.